As we head into the 35th anniversary for Sonic the Hedgehog, I feel like there's an important topic that's circulating amongst the community. That topic revolves around the lore and the canon, which is something that's always kind of, in contention. All right, it's time to, tap the sign again. SEGA has hired a lore manager to ensure that there's more continuity across games, animation, comics, and more. This was in 2022. We're about to be in 2026, so we're in this new era. Why are we once again tapping the sign? Well, it's because the newest Sonic Racing Cross Worlds trailer just brought this all the way back into discussion, and it's kind of interesting. It's like, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? So yesterday, 2 new characters were revealed for Sonic Racing Cross Worlds. We got Tangle and Whisper. A lot of Sonic fans were pretty happy about this. Obviously, there were some that weren't, but the most interesting thing about these 2 characters finally appearing in a mainline, I guess, continuity type game is the fact that we've received clarity on a couple of things. Whoa, Sonic Racing Cross Worlds is a spin-off. What do you mean mainline continuity type game? Well, let me explain. So this right here is the Twitter profile of the current Sonic lore manager. This person asked him a question and said, not really that important, but do you think that these 2 were canonically invited to the Cross Worlds Grand Prix, or are they just under the umbrella of bonus non-canonical additions like the rest of the DLC characters? To which he replied and said they're as canon as the other Sonic characters. So in case you were wondering, yes, the Sonic IDW comic books are in fact canon. They have been for years, and we've gotten confirmation of this many times, but you'd be surprised in these videos in the comment sections how many people either do not know this or deny the fact that it's true, which is actually what some Sonic fans did. This person tweeted, if IDW characters were canon, they would be in the base roster. Since they're not, they appear as a DLC collab, no interactions and no voices as well. Not only that, they would also appear in the Sonic Channel character section. The lore master doesn't know what the canon means. And of course, not everyone was happy with the announcement. This post says, would be hypocritical to dismiss the IDW bums given the other guests, but it gives worrying signals for the future of the franchise. So that statement definitely carries a lot of weight. I mean, there's some questions that I do have with regards to this, but first and foremost, we now know that Sonic Racing Cross Worlds is in fact canon, which, does kind of bring up a couple of other questions I have. The lore manager said that the Sonic characters are canon. So yeah, I mean, if you go into the game, you'll notice like SpongeBob and Patrick, yeah, they're probably not canon. But then I look at characters like the Hedgehog, and I also look at the Sonic Prime characters, and now I'm wondering okay, so if the Sonic characters are canon, what exactly do you mean? Are you saying all of them? Are you saying some of them? Discussion aside, I think the way you explain Sonic Racing Cross World being canon is that everything you see within the game is like a simulator. So we're in one of the time trials, and if you look right behind me, this portal right here, before you start any cross world time trial, you end up in this little racetrack simulator type area. So I think everything within this is not actually real, even though the characters and their experiences are. So that could explain potentially how the Sonic Prime characters or the Hedgehog get in there, but maybe the only characters that are canon are the actual mainline series characters, and now, considering the IDW characters in, they are as well. So you can see how sometimes interjecting things into the canon and confirming them does kind of add more questions when they're not fully answered. So the question is, should everything be canon? Is it a good thing that the IDW comics are canon? What do we think about this more unified approach? So, before we get into the Sonic Prime problem, I'd like to talk about my personal opinion on the matter. I actually am a fan of having continuity and the products that you consume actually do matter, but maybe that's just kind of like a marketing scheme. Maybe they tell you things are canon, so you're more likely to buy the product. I'm not ashamed to admit that, yeah, it does work on me. So while I do like it, I feel like some issues do arise where the team has to be extremely careful with how they handle the material in shows or comics or whatever alternative media that they consider to be canon. Sonic Prime is probably the best example of the whole everything is canon kind of thing backfiring on SEGA. Because if you think about it, by the time the show ended, it left a lot of people confused and angry, and people were just not happy with how the product was handled. People weren't happy about how the main character Sonic was written and how he was portrayed. There were questions about inconsistencies, such as why is Knuckles hanging out in Green Hill and they called it home. So I think without going into the micro specific details about the show, I think where it really all fell on its face is at the end, when we were all expecting to get an answer answer as to when it takes place on the timeline because, you know, they did say that it is canon, so it has to fit somewhere in the timeline. And then Ian Flynn says you'll find out at the end of the show, and then he comes out with this vague answer saying it could be any time between Advance and basically before Frontiers, which doesn't really do anything for people. So they got angry because they couldn't commit to answers that people wanted about the show. Furthermore, it turns out the story self-contained and wiped itself out. So at the end of the day, yes, the show's canon, but it doesn't actually matter because it doesn't exist. So you can see like why committing to certain things like this can create expectations for people that ultimately they're not able to deliver on. And we will talk about self-containment as well as exclusivity to alternative media later on in the video. But ultimately, when it comes to the discussion of making things canon, I think about Sonic X, which yes, the story of Sonic X isn't canon to the mainline franchise, but the mainline franchise was canon to events from the show. For example, they did an adaptation of Sonic Adventure 2. They did an adaptation of Sonic Adventure 1. They certainly handled it in a brilliant way because they're able to have the creative liberties that they want with the show, but also they keep it faithful to the original source material. They have good writing for the characters. And while it's not canon, I think it scratches the itch of people who want a canon show. So then when you compare that back to Sonic Prime, if you think about the final season of the show where it's basically 6 episodes of one battle scene, you know, you have to ask yourself the question, were creative liberties sacrificed in order to fit within these arbitrary guidelines that were imposed because the show has to follow a canon? In addition to the fact that the show wipes itself out, you have to ask yourself, were some sacrifices made? And maybe the answer is yes, but obviously there's a lot of factors that go into it, like the writing, the studio producing it in Sega's guidelines. But these are all questions that arise when you try to fit everything into this one connected universe. Regardless, the fans were split, and I don't think that's necessarily the best case scenario. In terms of actual real applied examples of this potentially being a problem, I think Prime probably is the best example of this backfiring. So in terms of the discussion about alternative media becoming canon, the context problem is something that I do see a lot. Well, I don't think it's really a huge deal, and there's certainly ways that they can address this, but the main issue that arises from this is that people, in order to get the full context of the story for whatever the franchise is, they would have to consume products that maybe you have to pay for or have a subscription service for in order to get the full context, when they think that you should just be able to play the games to get the full story. The best that we got in the mainline games was the fact that Sonic had this throwaway line about Tangle and Amy doing a throwaway line about Styx. So far it hasn't really been intrusive to the main games, but someone did make a good point about the IDW games being canon and the context problem. So this person says it can be canon, but my concern is the idea that you need to read the comics to understand the games. That's what we discussed earlier. He said that Street Fighter does something similar and it's low-key annoying. Same with Mortal Kombat. And this Sonic lore account says, as I said in my comment, the comics are very secondary to the canon. Ian Flynn said that if a comic book character appears in the games, he'll have to introduce them to give context to those who don't read the comics. So for those of you who are concerned about the context problem, it's been thoroughly addressed by Ian Flynn, and I think that's probably the best solution. But at the end of the day, you do raise some questions like, okay, the comic stories will always be secondary, which means do they have to hold back and not do anything too crazy, which could limit the scope of the storytelling in order to fit within those guidelines? That's kind of what we talked about with Prime. And to bring it back to Prime, the question is, would you have a show that's good but not canon and faithful to the source material, or would you prefer a show that's worse but technically considered canon? These are all things that you think about, and with this new announcement, surely these discussions won't go away, but I'd love to know what you guys have to say about this.